No assistant lasted a day working for a paralyzed CEO, until a single dad refused to quit. The placement agency had a code for it. Not a stamp, not a big red warning plastered across the file, just a small flag, the kind most people in the office recognized and quietly passed around without saying much out loud. You'd see it, and you'd nod, and you'd move on to the next candidate. Because the flag meant one thing: nobody lasts here. 7 assistants in 4 months. The first one lasted 3 days. The second made it to the end of day 1 before emailing her resignation from a coffee shop 2 blocks away. The third, a sharp, experienced woman with 12 years in executive support, lasted exactly 4 hours and then calmly packed her bag, said nothing to anyone, and never came back for her umbrella. The fourth sent a resignation text from the parking garage. The fifth never came in at all after the second morning, just didn't show up. Her phone went to voicemail, her LinkedIn page went quiet. People at the agency liked to joke, darkly, that maybe she'd just escaped into a simpler life somewhere, become a dog walker, moved to the coast. The sixth lasted 2 weeks, which was practically a record. She cried in the break room 3 times, according to witnesses, and on her last day she handed over a neatly typed exit statement, 3 paragraphs, detailing why she was leaving. Nobody in the office read it. The point was already understood. The seventh didn't even have a real story. She just never felt right to begin with, and everyone knew it, including her. And then there was the flag, and the flag meant, don't send anyone here who has options. The client's name was Raymond Cole, 46 years old, CEO of a mid-sized freight and logistics company based out of Cincinnati, Ohio, the kind of company that moves things no one sees, connects supply chains no one thinks about, and quietly keeps a certain portion of the country's commerce from falling apart. The company was called Trellis Logistics. It was not flashy. It was not the kind of business that showed up in magazines or made headlines. But it made money, and it made it consistently, and that was because Raymond Cole ran it like a machine that had no patience for noise. He had been in a wheelchair for 6 years. A highway accident, late December, a patch of black ice on a ramp just outside Louisville, Kentucky, and a truck that came around a corner wider than it should have. Raymond had been driving alone. He walked into the hospital. He did not walk out. He was fully paralyzed from the chest down. His mind, for better or worse, was completely untouched. People who worked at Trellis described Raymond Cole in the way you might describe weather, not with affection exactly, but with a certain resigned respect. He was precise the way a cold morning is precise. He communicated without padding. He had no small talk and no interest in acquiring any. He held people to a standard that he himself had already exceeded, and he did not apologize for this, and he did not expect you to enjoy it. Before the accident, he had been the same. The wheelchair had not changed his personality. If anything, the people around him felt it had concentrated it, like everything soft had already been burned off somewhere on that Louisville ramp, and what remained was just the essential Raymond Cole, stripped to the root. He ran board meetings by dictating into the air in front of him, fast and dense, and he expected whoever was beside him to keep up. He corrected people in front of other people without apology. He noticed when things were done wrong, and he said so, and he moved on. He did not hold grudges. He had no room for grudges. He just expected you to get it right the next time, and if you couldn't, that was useful information. He did not ask for sympathy. He did not offer it, and assistants, one after another, could not survive it. The ones who left gave different reasons. Too demanding, too cold, too intense. The working environment was too high pressure. The pace was unsustainable. One woman told the agency it felt like working inside someone's brain during a crisis, except the crisis never ended, it was just the default state. What none of them said out loud, what all of them understood without saying, was the other thing. The thing that sat under all the other reasons. Raymond Cole made people feel like they didn't matter. Not cruelly, not on purpose. Just, he moved so fast, expected so much, corrected so cleanly, that standing next to him long enough made most people feel invisible. And nobody wants to feel invisible. The man who eventually didn't leave was named Daniel Park. He was 38 years old, Korean-American, born in Indianapolis, raised partly there and partly in a series of apartments that got smaller as he grew up. He had a second-grade daughter named Priya. Her mother's name had won that particular negotiation, and an ex-wife in Tucson who was doing fine, and a checking account with roughly $340 in it on the day he walked into the Trellis Logistics building for the first time. He carried his own lunch in a zipper bag. Turkey on wheat, cut in half. An apple. A small Ziploc of goldfish crackers that he'd grabbed from Priya's school bag that morning by accident and only realized once he was on the highway. He didn't know he'd grabbed them until he sat down for lunch and thought, well, goldfish crackers it is. That was sort of how Daniel Park moved through the world. He had not come from money. He had not come from connections. He had come from a version of the Midwest that doesn't get written about very often, the kind where the factories had been closing for 20 years and everybody was adjusting to something they didn't have a word for yet. His dad had worked 2 jobs for most of Daniel's childhood, the kind of jobs where you come home and sit quietly for a while before you can be a person again. His mom had done bookkeeping for 3 different small businesses over the years, whichever ones would take her. Daniel had worked, in the 5 years before landing at Trellis, as a hotel concierge, a night shift warehouse supervisor, and briefly, unsuccessfully, as a real estate agent. He had tried the real estate thing for 11 months before deciding it was not for him. Not because he couldn't sell, he could, but because he kept telling people the truth about the houses, and it turns out that's not a great strategy in real estate. He needed this job. He was not pretending otherwise. He needed it the way people need things when there's a kid involved, and the kid needs new shoes, and the rent is coming, and you've been holding things together with goodwill and prayer, and not much else. He was not going to quit. That was not a virtue. That was arithmetic. The placement agency had told him, gently, what he was walking into. The previous 7, the flag in the system. They'd done it in that particular way agencies have when they're legally obligated to tell you something, but are also hoping you'll back out, so they don't have to feel responsible for what happens next. Daniel had listened. He'd asked a few questions about the work itself, about the schedule, about the logistics of the physical environment, and then he'd said he'd like to try it. The woman at the agency had looked at him for a second longer than necessary. She'd said, "Are you sure?" He'd said, "Yeah." She'd said, "He's very demanding." Daniel had said, "That's okay." She'd said, "The last 7 assistants." He'd said, "I know. You told me. I'd still like to try it." She'd put down her pen and nodded slowly, the way people nod when they believe you but also know something you don't, and she'd sent him on his way. Day 1 started at 7:45 in the morning. Raymond Cole was already at his desk when Daniel walked in. He had been there since 6:30. He would be there until 7 or 7:30 that evening. This was not unusual. This was Tuesday. Daniel introduced himself. Raymond looked up from the screen in front of him, a vertical monitor mounted low so he could see it from his chair, and looked at Daniel the way you look at a new piece of furniture you're not sure you like yet. Not unkind, just assessing. He said, "You're the new one." Daniel said, "Yes." Raymond said, "Good. Sit down. I need to dictate an email. No how are you. No welcome. No let me show you around the space." Daniel sat down and pulled out a legal pad from the bag he'd brought and said, "Ready when you are." Raymond dictated the email fast. It was dense. Logistics contract language, regional partner names, specific delivery windows and penalty clauses. Daniel wrote as fast as he could. When Raymond finished, he looked at Daniel and said, "Read it back." Daniel read it back. Raymond stopped him on the 3rd sentence. He said, "That's not what I said. I said standard window compliance, not standard window. Those are 2 different things. One of them costs us money." He wasn't shouting. He wasn't harsh. He said it the way you'd say it's raining when someone asks about the weather. Flat. Factual. Daniel looked at his notes. He said, "You're right. Give me the full sentence again. Not sorry. Not flustered. Not already thinking about whether he could get his old warehouse job back. Just, give me the sentence again." Raymond looked at him for a moment. 1 beat, 2 beats. Then he gave the sentence again, and Daniel wrote it down correctly, and they moved on. That was the first test. Raymond had not intended it as a test. It was just the way he worked. But without knowing it, Daniel had passed something in those 2 beats of silence, something the 7 previous assistants had all failed in their own ways, some by getting defensive, some by apologizing too much, some by going small and quiet and hoping the moment would pass over them. Daniel had just said, "Give me the sentence again," like it was a practical problem with a practical solution, which it was. Raymond had simply never had someone treat it that way before. By noon, Daniel had transcribed 4 emails, reorganized a meeting agenda, made 2 calls on Raymond's behalf to regional offices, and eaten his goldfish crackers at his desk because there hadn't been time for the actual sandwich. By 3, he'd sat in on a call with an East Coast shipping partner and taken notes fast enough that Raymond, at the end of it, looked at the summary Daniel produced and said nothing. Nothing as in, he didn't correct it. For Raymond Cole, that was a compliment. At 6 in the evening, Daniel packed his bag. He was tired in the way you get tired when you've been running at a speed you didn't know you had. His hand ached from writing. He'd drunk 4 cups of coffee and eaten exactly half a turkey sandwich and the goldfish crackers, and nothing else. He said goodnight to the 2 remaining staff still in the office. He went home, picked up Priya from the neighbor who watched her in the evenings, made her macaroni and cheese with the little hot dog pieces she liked cut up in it, listened to her talk about something that had happened at recess involving a butterfly and a disagreement about whether it was a monarch or just a regular orange one, and fell asleep on the couch with his shoes still on. He had not quit. That was day 1. The next 3 weeks were an education in a very specific kind of endurance. Raymond Cole pushed. Not maliciously, not with the awareness that he was testing Daniel's limits. He pushed the way water pushes, constantly, without rest, in whatever direction had the least resistance. And the pushing took many forms. He would change priorities mid-morning without announcement. A meeting Daniel had spent 40 minutes preparing materials for would simply cease to exist by 9, replaced by something else entirely, and Daniel would be expected to pivot without a single word of acknowledgement that the pivot had happened. He would dictate instructions that appeared to contradict instructions from the day before. Not because Raymond had changed his mind, often he hadn't, but because Raymond's mind moved faster than most people could track, and what sounded like a contradiction from the outside was, from inside Raymond's perspective, just a natural adjustment he hadn't bothered to explain. He would correct Daniel in front of the other staff, not loudly, just cleanly and precisely, the way you'd mark a wrong answer on a test, without cruelty, but also without the kind of softening that most people use to make corrections feel like collaboration. He had no small talk. None. You could walk into his office with something and he would look at you and wait. There was no good morning, no how's Priya, no idle anything. You spoke when you had something to say, and when you were done saying it, you were done. Most people found this suffocating. Daniel found it, oddly, efficient. He told his sister this during a phone call at the end of week 2. She said, "That sounds miserable." Daniel thought about it. He said, "No, actually it's kind of like working with someone who's really focused, you know? Like everything he says matters. There's no filler. You always know exactly where you stand." His sister was quiet for a second. Then she said, "Daniel, most bosses let you know where you stand through things like raises and positive feedback." He said, "Yeah, this isn't that." She said, "So how do you know you're doing okay?" He thought about it. He said, "He stopped correcting me as often." There was a pause. Then his sister said, "You know that's a very strange thing to take pride in." And Daniel said, "I know, but it's still true." There was one moment in week 2 that stuck with him afterward. It was a Wednesday afternoon. He'd been in a conference room with Raymond and 3 other senior staff, going over a quarterly contract review. The air in the room had the quality it sometimes got when numbers weren't working, that particular tension that comes from spreadsheets that tell the wrong story. Raymond had been speaking for about 20 minutes, laying out a restructuring plan for the Eastern Region contracts, and the plan was good. Daniel could tell it was good, even though he didn't fully understand all of it yet. But at some point, Raymond said something, and the room got quiet in a way that didn't feel like thinking. It felt like fear. Daniel looked around. The other three people at the table were all looking at somewhere slightly to the side of Raymond. Not at him, past him. The way you look past someone when you don't know what to say and you're hoping the moment moves on by itself. Raymond noticed. Raymond always noticed. He stopped speaking. The silence sat there. Then he said, very quietly, "Does anyone have a problem with this plan? Or are we all just going to stare at the wall?" "Nothing." Daniel said, "I have a question." Raymond looked at him. Daniel said, "You're restructuring the Eastern contracts around the new Louisville hub, but that hub doesn't have its third dock cleared for use until Q3, so the first 2 months of this plan would have to run on reduced capacity. Is that already factored in, or do we need to build in a contingency window?" Silence. Then Raymond said, "It's factored in. Page 7 of the annex. But it's a valid question and you're the first person in this room to ask it, so now I know who's actually reading the materials." He looked around the table once. He said, "Everyone else can start doing that." He moved on. Daniel kept his face neutral. But under the table, he let out a long, slow breath he'd been holding since the moment he'd opened his mouth. 6 weeks in, Raymond's company had a board meeting. It went wrong. Not catastrophically. Not in a way the outside world would ever know about. But it went wrong in the way things go wrong inside companies that are built around one person's vision, which is to say, the wrong was deeply personal, even though it expressed itself in numbers and projections and strategic disagreements around a polished table. The Eastern region contracts were underperforming, not by much, but enough, and 2 board members, both men who had joined the company after Raymond's accident, who had seen the company only in its post-Raymond in a wheelchair form, had questions, careful questions, diplomatic questions, questions wrapped so thickly in respect that you could almost not see what was inside them. But Daniel could see, and he was fairly sure Raymond could see too. The questions, underneath all the politeness, were asking, "Are you still up to this? Is the company still in capable hands? Is there someone else, someone without your complications, who should be making these calls?" Raymond handled it the way Raymond handled everything, precisely, without waste. He answered each question directly, with numbers, with reasoning, with the kind of clarity that made it hard to argue back because there was nothing soft to push against. But there was a moment, 40 seconds maybe, where his voice went somewhere Daniel hadn't heard it go before. Not rage, something older, something that had been sitting in a drawer for a long time. The room went cold and still. Everyone at that table had felt the air shift. Nobody looked at each other. Nobody reached for their water glass. They all sat there holding the same breath, while Raymond Cole, in 40 seconds, showed them just a sliver of what it cost him to sit in that chair and prove himself to people who didn't deserve the proof. And then the 40 seconds were over and Raymond was back. Clean, precise, continuing. The meeting ended. People filed out. In the hallway, Daniel's colleague Nora caught his arm and whispered, "Is he okay?" Daniel said, "Yeah, he's fine." She said, He said, "I know, he's fine." He wasn't sure why he said it with such certainty. But he was certain. Afterward, the office emptied slowly. By 6:45, almost everyone was gone. Daniel was still at his desk, updating the travel itinerary for Raymond's Chicago trip next week, when he heard the electric hum of the wheelchair coming down the hall. Raymond rolled in from the direction of his office and stopped near Daniel's desk. He didn't say anything for a moment. Daniel kept typing. Then Raymond said, "The woman before you, the 6th one," she cried in front of a client. Daniel looked up. Raymond said it plainly, no expression around it. Just the fact, sitting there. Daniel said, "What happened?" Raymond said, "I finished the meeting." Daniel nodded. He said, "That was probably the right call." Raymond looked at him. Something shifted in the room. Not warmth exactly, not the sudden crumbling of Raymond's particular wall, more like an acknowledgement. The way 2 people who have been sitting across from each other in a difficult situation finally agree, without saying it, that the situation is in fact difficult. Raymond said, "You've been here 6 weeks." Daniel said, "Yeah." Raymond said, "The previous record was 2 weeks." Daniel said, Raymond said, Why are you still here? It was a genuine question, not a challenge, not a test. He actually wanted to know. Daniel thought about it for a second. He said, I need the work, and I'm not bad at it. Raymond said, You're better than not bad. He said it the way you'd say the coffee is hot. Just a fact. Then he rolled back down the hall toward his office. Daniel stared at the itinerary for a moment. Then he went back to typing. There was something Daniel had figured out by week 4 that he'd never told anyone, because it was the kind of thing that sounded strange out loud. Raymond Cole was not a difficult man. He was an honest one, and most people, in Daniel's experience, could not tell the difference. The previous 7 assistants, Daniel had heard bits and pieces about some of them, had all encountered the same thing and arrived at the same conclusion. That Raymond was harsh, exacting, cold, impossible. That working for him was a kind of punishment. But what Daniel had understood, slowly, over weeks of watching, was that Raymond treated everyone the same. The board members, the junior shipping coordinators, the cleaning staff. The guy who came to fix the HVAC. He spoke to all of them with the same level of direct, unpadded attention. He corrected them all when they were wrong. He didn't soften it differently based on who they were. Most people experience this as cruelty. Daniel experienced it as respect. Because what Raymond was actually doing was treating people like they were capable of handling the truth, like they didn't need to be managed, like they were adults who could be spoken to plainly. Daniel had grown up around people who sugarcoated everything to the point where you never knew what was actually happening. Bosses who said great job and meant something else. People who smiled at you and complained about you to someone else the moment you turned around. Relationships where nothing was ever said directly, and so nothing was ever actually fixed. Raymond Cole said directly, always, about everything. It was uncomfortable. It required you to be present all the time, to not coast, to show up as your actual self rather than a version of yourself that you thought someone wanted to see. But it was also, underneath all of that, deeply uncomplicated. You always knew where you were with Raymond. Daniel had spent his whole adult life not knowing where he was with people, so he stayed. There was also the fact that Raymond Cole was, under all the precision and the directness, doing something remarkable. He was running a company from a wheelchair. He was making major financial decisions and holding major professional relationships and navigating major industry pressures from a body that had stopped cooperating 6 years ago. He had rebuilt himself, not his personality, which had stayed the same, but his systems, his routines, his whole way of being in a professional world that was not designed for the way he now had to be in it, entirely from scratch, and he had never, as far as Daniel could see, asked for anything, not sympathy, not accommodation beyond what was strictly necessary, not the lowered expectations that some people would have quietly offered and that Raymond would have, Daniel was absolutely certain, found insulting. He had just kept going. Daniel understood that too, not because his life had been hard in the same way, it hadn't, but he understood the arithmetic of just keeping going when there was no other option. He understood doing the next thing when the next thing was the only thing. Priya needed new shoes, so he worked. The rent was due, so he worked. There was no grand philosophy in it, it was just the math of his life. He recognized something similar in Raymond Cole, not the same math, but the same arithmetic. 3 months in, something changed in the office. It was small, the kind of small that you don't notice while it's happening, and only understand later when you look back at it. The other staff started staying later. Not because Raymond asked them to, not because there was some new workplace policy or pressure from above. Just, gradually, without announcement, the office stopped emptying at 5:30 on the dot, the way it always had. People lingered. They had conversations in the hallway that lasted longer than they needed to. They stopped eating lunch at their desks alone and started eating in the small break room together. Daniel noticed this. He wasn't sure what to make of it at first. Then Nora said to him one afternoon, "You know people are different since you got here." He said, "What do you mean?" She said, "You talk to him like a person." He said, "I mean, he is a person." She said, "Yeah, but you're not scared of him, and people used to be scared of him. Not because he's scary, just because nobody knew how to, be around him, without it being weird. Daniel thought about this. He said, he's pretty easy to be around once you stop trying to manage him. Nora looked at him like he'd said something slightly profound and slightly obvious at the same time. She said, none of us ever stopped trying to manage him. The other change was smaller and harder to name. Raymond started explaining things. Not everything, not all the time, but occasionally, after a decision that might have looked strange from the outside, or before a meeting with a difficult partner, he would say a sentence or two. Context, background, the reasoning that, previously, he had carried entirely in his own head and expected everyone around him to simply trust. He never announced that he was doing this. It wasn't a policy shift. It wasn't a moment where he said, I'm going to be more communicative. He just started doing it. Once, walking down the hallway toward a meeting room, he said to Daniel, without looking at him, the guy we're meeting with in here thinks I owe him a favor from a deal we did in 2021. I don't. He's going to try to collect it anyway, just so you know the temperature in the room. Daniel said, got it. Raymond said, you don't need to do anything. I just wanted you to know. That was it. They went into the meeting, but afterward, Daniel thought about it. 7 assistants had walked into that kind of room with Raymond without knowing the temperature. And they'd walked in feeling like they were missing something, like the silence around them was somehow their failure to understand, and it had accumulated over time into a feeling of inadequacy they eventually couldn't live with. Raymond telling Daniel the temperature wasn't warmth, it was respect. He'd decided Daniel was worth informing. The moment that people in the Trellis logistics office would later talk about. The moment that made it into the version of the story that got passed around. That became the version told at happy hours and in whispered conversations in the break room. Happened on a Thursday in November, 4 months into Daniel's time there. Priya had no school that day. Teacher development day or something. Daniel had arranged for his neighbor to watch her in the morning and was going to pick her up at lunch. But the neighbor had a thing come up and so Priya ended up at the office. She was 7. She wore a jacket with a cartoon dog on it that had a zipper for a nose. She carried a small backpack shaped like a strawberry. She sat in the extra chair near Daniel's desk and did her reading homework very seriously for about 20 minutes, and then started looking around the office with the unfiltered curiosity of a child who has not yet learned that staring at things is sometimes impolite. She stared at the copy machine for a while. She stared at the fish tank near the reception desk. She stared at the framed certificates on the wall. And then Raymond Cole wheeled past the open door of Daniel's office, and Priya turned and looked at him, and she looked at his wheelchair, and she kept looking. Daniel started to say something. Her name, probably, in the particular parental tone that means redirect your attention. But Raymond had already stopped in the doorway. He and Priya looked at each other. She said, "Does that go fast?" She meant the wheelchair. Raymond said, "Fast enough." She said, "Can I push you?" There was a silence. Not an uncomfortable one, just a silence. Raymond looked at Daniel. Daniel shrugged. He had learned by now that Raymond didn't need him to manage every situation. Raymond looked back at Priya. He said, "Sure." Priya pushed Raymond Cole around the main floor of Trellis Logistics for 8 minutes. She pushed him past Nora's desk, where Nora pretended to be very busy but was actually watching from the corner of her eye. She pushed him past the copy machine, which he explained to her in practical terms. It makes copies of papers. She said, "Like homework." He said, "Mostly like contracts." She said, "What's a contract?" He said, "A promise that 2 companies write down." She pushed him past the fish tank, and he told her the fish was named Gerald, which was a name none of the staff had ever heard anyone use before, and several of them would spend the next week trying to figure out if Raymond had just made that up on the spot, or if the fish had always been named Gerald and no one had ever asked. She pushed him back toward Daniel's office and then stopped in front of a window that looked out at the parking lot and said, "That's our car." Raymond looked at the car. He said, "It's a good car." She said, "It makes a sound sometimes." "Daddy says it's fine." He said, "What kind of sound?" She made the sound. It was a pretty good impression of a specific kind of engine complaint. Raymond said, "That's the alternator belt." Tell your dad to get it looked at, she said. She pushed him back to the doorway of Daniel's office, and Raymond thanked her, actually thanked her, with the word thank you, which Daniel had not heard him direct at anyone before without it being attached to a specific professional transaction. And Priya said you're welcome and went back to her strawberry backpack. Raymond looked at Daniel. He said, alternator belt. Daniel said, I heard. Raymond went back to his office. Daniel looked at his daughter, who was already back inside her reading homework, completely unbothered. He thought, that's it. That's all it is, isn't it? She hadn't tried to manage Raymond Cole. She hadn't tried to figure out the right way to behave around him or the correct emotional register to bring to the interaction. She'd seen a person in a wheelchair and asked if she could push him and then done it. That was the whole thing. That was what the 7 others had never managed to do. At the end of 1 year, Raymond did something unexpected. He sent Daniel paperwork. Not a raise, not a formal review. Paperwork. Specifically, a minor equity stake in a subsidiary logistics project that Raymond had been developing quietly for about 8 months. Not a large stake, but a real one, the kind with actual value attached to it. There was no explanation in the email, no speech, no conversation about it, just the paperwork and a line at the bottom. Review this with your own attorney before signing. Daniel read it twice. He called Raymond's office extension. Raymond picked up. Daniel said, I got the paperwork. Raymond said, yes. Daniel said, thank you. Raymond said, you can thank me when the project earns money. Daniel said, okay. Raymond said, get the alternator belt. He hung up. Daniel sat at his desk for a minute. Then he called the mechanic. He told his sister that evening. She was quiet on the phone for a second. Then she said, do you like him? Daniel thought about it. He said, I respect him. She said, that's not what I asked. He said, I know, but it's the right answer. It's not that kind of thing. It's not friendship exactly. It's more like, he paused. He said, you know how some people make you better at things just by being around them? Not because they're nice to you, just because their standards are so clear that your own standards start rising to meet them? She said, yes. He said, that's what it is. She said, and that's enough for you? He said, more than enough. She said, you are such a strange person. He said, I know. She said, in the best way. He said, I know. Here is the thing about the story of Raymond Cole and Daniel Park, that the people at the placement agency, the people who watched from the outside, the people who passed around the story at happy hours, here is what most of them got slightly wrong. They told it as a story about endurance. About a single dad who needed a job badly enough to stick it out through something most people couldn't handle. About grit and necessity. And those things were true. They were part of it. But Daniel, years later, would tell it differently. He would say, it wasn't really about me at all. People would look at him like he was being modest. He'd say, no, I mean it. The story is about what Raymond was doing. People kept leaving because they thought he was making things hard. But he wasn't. He was doing what he'd always done. He was just being himself. Completely, exactly, without softening. And that is an incredibly hard thing to be when the world keeps leaving because of it. He'd say, he kept replacing assistants. He kept starting over. He never once, as far as I could see, adjusted who he was to make people more comfortable. He never once said, maybe I should soften this. Maybe I should add a little padding. Maybe I should make this easier for them to be around. He'd say, that's not stubbornness. That's something else. That's a kind of faith, actually. A faith that eventually someone would show up who didn't need him to be different. And then he'd pause, and he'd say, I just happened to be that person. It didn't take any particular courage. I just had a kid and a checking account and nowhere else to be. People usually laughed when he said this. Daniel always laughed too. But underneath the laugh was something true. And he knew it, and Raymond probably knew it. And even Priya, in her 7-year-old way, had sensed it the afternoon she pushed a CEO around an office floor and asked about a fish named Gerald. The world keeps trying to make you into a softer version of yourself. The people who refuse to let it, who stay exactly who they are, at full force, Through accident and difficulty and people walking out again and again, those people are rare. And the people who can stand next to them without flinching are rarer still. 2 years after Daniel Park started at Trellis Logistics, the placement agency quietly removed the flag from Raymond Cole's file. Nobody made an announcement about it. The woman who had asked Daniel, "Are you sure?" just opened the file one afternoon, looked at it for a moment, and deleted the flag. She moved on to the next file. That was the whole ceremony. Priya turned 9 in the spring. For her birthday, she asked for a fish. Daniel bought her one. She named it Gerald. Daniel sent Raymond a photo. A picture of a small orange fish in a round tank on Priya's desk. Raymond replied, "Good choice." That was the whole conversation. It was enough. The alternator belt had been replaced 11 months earlier. The car still made a sound sometimes. Daniel still said it was fine. It was fine.